Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare.
Unfortunately, this episode of A Pair of Bookends is with one singular bookend, me, Hannah. Today's conversation will be hosted by me because Lydia, my co-host and right arm, is unfortunately poorly at the moment, and I'm sure our listeners will join us in wishing that she gets better soon so you can have her back in your ears. Welcome back, Bookends, to a bonus books episode where today I'll be joined by Balli Kaur Jaswal to chat about her latest novel, Now You See Us. Now You See Us is a darkly humorous and sharply observed tale of three Fillipina domestic workers who move to Singapore for better work opportunities. For Corazon, Angel and Danita, being a maid means being invisible. But when a friend is accused of murdering her employer, the three are forced to decide between staying silent and safe or raising the alarm against the continual injustice. Balli Kaur Jaswal is a Singaporean novelist and writer raised in Japan, Russia and the Philippines. Balli studied creative writing in the United States and has held fellowships at the University of East Anglia and Nanyang Technological University, where she also completed her PhD in South Asian diaspora writing. Her non-fiction has appeared in the New York Times, Harper's Bazaar India and Refinery 29, amongst other publications. Balli is the author of 5 novels, including the hugely international success Erotic Stories for Punjabi Widows, which is a Reese Witherspoon book club pick in 2018 and had the movie rights sold to Scott Free Productions and Film 4. Her latest novel, Now You See Us, will be published in the UK on the 25th of May by HarperCollins, and I am so excited to have Balli joining me today. So Balli, welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you, Hannah. So nice to talk to you.
Yeah, so lovely to have you. Now, we always like to start our interviews by asking what you are currently reading.
Okay, so I don't know if it's a current read, if I just put it down, if I just finished the last
That's perfect.
I think it counts. Yeah. Big Swiss by Jen Beagin.
I've just finished that too.
Have you?
Yes.
It is funny and dark and weird. It's like nothing I've read recently.
Yeah.
So I'm
wacky,
very intrigued.
Cool.
It's so yeah. Until the end, like it just kept getting wackier. The last 100 pages, still really strange.
You thought it couldn't get any stranger, and then donkeys appear. So you're like, okay, cool.
Yeah. And I really admire the way the author just went for it. Yeah. Okay, donkeys. Yeah. Okay, bees. Okay, the dog. Like just all his, I mean, these aren't all animals, but yeah, the subject matter. She manages to kind of, balance like some very dark things. And you feel that undercurrent of those very dark things with some really, really funny moments.
Yeah.
And you take both of them seriously. It's amazing. It's a real feat. I think that book, it's pretty
absolutely. It's a perfect balance, and I think it's the perfect casting that they've got Jodie Comer for the HBO adaptation.
I didn't know that. I didn't.
Yes, yeah, okay. HBO series, and it's going to have Jodie Comer in it, and Jodie Comer from Killing Eve, and I just think she's perfect. She's just got her humor is so like dark and quick, and I just think she's a perfect person for it. Yeah, a great book.
I'm glad you read it too.
It's brilliant.
Share that,
and it's coming out this month, I think. So I will include that in the show notes. Now, onto your book, Now You See Us. I enjoyed it so much, and I've got so many questions that when I was writing them out, I'm like, I'm definitely not going to fit all of these questions in, but I'm going to try because there's so much I want to talk about. But I would firstly love to start by asking what the inspiration was behind Now You See Us.
So the inspiration, it goes back a long way. When I was about 15 or 16, my family moved to the Philippines from Singapore for my dad's job. And that was around the time when I'd had some experiences in Singapore that made me realize that, there were certain power imbalances. Not that I didn't know that before, but I think I really acutely felt it and felt the injustice of certain power imbalances between, when it came to what the truth was about a particular story or a particular incident. So I'd had a sort of a run-in with an authority figure at school that really, really sort of hit very deep. And we moved to the Philippines, and it was a couple of years after a domestic worker from the Philippines had been executed in Singapore for murdering her employer's child and another domestic worker. And it was still fresh in the minds of a lot of people in the Philippines. And having grown up in Singapore, I'd only heard one side of the story, which was told to us by state media. And that was the only form of media. That was the only place we could get our news from. And we were just, wholeheartedly told that, she was guilty. And that was it. And the investigation was closed. But in the Philippines, there was a whole different story. There was a whole different view of that investigation. Mm-hmm. And it was a time of really kind of tense diplomatic relations between both countries. And I felt a little bit, in certain moments, a little bit, caught in the middle of those two narratives. Mm-hmm. And I found it really fascinating. Like, for the first time, I think at the age of 15, I was hearing people directly tell me, no, the story that you heard is all wrong. Here's what really happened. That to me was really powerful, like realizing that, the truth actually changes, depending on who you hear it from, what people have at stake, who has power in telling that story. So that was, I suppose, the seed for it. But of course, I didn't at 15 go, I'm going to write a novel 20 years from now. But it always stayed with me. And it kind of fueled my sense of injustice. And it also opened up my eyes to a lot of things. So, there's certain moments you have when you're young, when like a door sort of opens, just a crack and some light comes in. This was one of those things for me. So then a couple of years ago, my husband and I relocated to Singapore after traveling, and living in a number of different places. And then I was thinking about, or I'm sort of experiencing life here and observing the lives of domestic workers and thinking about that narrative that Singapore has of being wealthy and economically progressive and highly developed, and thinking, well, yes, but at what cost? And, upon whose backs are we building this very successful city? And Singapore is really enjoying that public image of being, this wealthy, success story. So it came back to me again, that moment when I realized that there was this entire other narrative. And I started thinking about how I would write a story about a similar incident happening in, 2019 or sort of present day, where there are more sources of narratives, where you have social media, you have WhatsApp, you have ways of kind of galvanizing people to investigate things, how that will complicate things. And that's more or less the inspiration for it.
That's amazing. And I already found, the book, when I've read it, I found it such an eye-opening read. And I think, if you don't have experience of, I don't know, like none of my family would have had like domestic workers, we're not from like a wealthy background or anything like that. So we wouldn't have had like people working for us. I don't know anybody that had that. So this is a whole new world to me. And especially that it's set in Singapore, I've never been. So, it's all brand new information to me. And then when I came to the end and I read your author's note and seeing that this was, based on a true story, it really shocked me because, you're so right. It is all about perspective. And when you're reading from the perspective of these workers, you're like, well, of course it's not going to have been them. They're these people that are the elite of Singapore. They can cover anything up that they want because they've got the power to. And these women, they are, what's the word, they're sort of trapped by their own fear because they can't speak out because they'll lose their jobs. They won't have money to send back home. They won't have money for themselves, and this whole like network of people will just pass on that they're sort of not a great worker, and then they won't have a future job. So it's, perspective is so important. And I was wondering, is that why you chose to go down the multiple perspectives route with this story?
Yeah, there's so many ways in which women, domestic workers in Singapore are vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So of course, like, for the sake of story, there's a murder, and that's kind of an extreme, someone's accused of murder, and that's a way in which you see the justice system really not working for these women. But there are day-to-day things, and I really wanted to focus on that. And there were so many things that I couldn't heap them on just one person. I thought that would be unfair. So I wanted to kind of do a bit of a cross-section of the lives of different domestic workers of different ages and different perspectives as well. Like not all of them jump so readily into investigating this murder, right? Like Cora, for example, goes, let it be. And unfortunately, that's the way most of when I spoke to domestic workers, I think most of them were just like, keep your head down, don't get into trouble, like grumble amongst yourselves, but don't rock the boat because our livelihoods are too important for that.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's why I kind of chose. And I also chose to kind of put them in different sorts of families, different employment situations, to just show how precarious it is. Like their fates depend so largely on how they are treated by their employers.
Yeah. I mean, you have Mrs. Fan, who is just probably the most unlikable character, one of the most unlikable characters I have ever read. It's like this. like she just gets worse and worse. Yeah,
I know. She really does.
So cheap and writing somebody that awful.
You know, I think that there was a lot of vengeance in my writing of her. I think I was so angry because I run into a Mrs. Fan, I would say, at least 5 times a year in Singapore. Like they're not uncommon enough, unfortunately. They're like the woman who cuts in line in front of you and then shouts at you when you tell her, actually, I was next. They're incredibly entitled. They sort of barge into spaces. Or actually the week that I started writing this novel, I had sort of, I think it was my son, my son was like 3 at the time, or like he was younger maybe, and he was going to a gymnastics class. And there was another parent, there was another mom who was like angry about something. I don't know. She got into kind of an argument with one of the instructors. And she's very well heeled, very, very made up, looked very sophisticated. But she got so angry that she took her high heel Ferragamo shoe off and threw it at the mirror, and it cracked the mirror. No. And she threw this tantrum, and I was like, that's my character. that's who I want to write about. Yeah, there she is. Yeah, like because at first I was like, am I exaggerating? And then like I would meet these Mrs. Fans and I'd be like, nope, not exaggerating. You are here. You are there. You're everywhere around me. Yeah.
Just when I think I can't be surprised anymore, there's real people out there like this.
Yeah, be hideous.
Now, obviously, you touched on it a little bit before, but you interviewed various domestic workers as part of your research process. Could you tell us a bit more about that research process? And, I'm interested, was there anything that particularly struck you about these interviews?
So I created the 3 characters before interviewing the domestic workers because I wanted character to come first. I didn't want kind of circumstance to be the basis of the characters. So I really thought, like, who is this person? If you removed everything, if you remove the poverty, if you remove the, the circumstances, the work that they do, who are they at the core of who they are? And then once I kind of sketched them out, I think it was sort of maybe in the first sort of 25% of the first draft was when I realized, okay, I'm running out of steam a little bit. I need to talk to women to kind of get a sense of the minutiae and the details and a bit more of context as well of what their lives are like in the Philippines. And that was what I focused on quite a bit, actually, or that was what, came up quite naturally in conversation was like, I didn't want to shine a direct light on what's it like, like what's your day-to-day, what's your timetable, in your employer's home. Because I just wanted to chat with them as people and wanted to find out like, what was your childhood like? Like, what was, what's your favorite thing to do with your family when you go back? And those conversations were really revealing. Like, they shared it was a little side anecdotes about their lives, the things that they missed, the things that they sacrificed, but also like the things that they enjoyed in Singapore, like the independence that they had, the financial independence in particular. So the fact that their families kind of put them on a pedestal because they were overseas and they were providing for their families, and the homes that they had built as well. Some of these women were, I think there was one woman I talked to who's she's probably in her mid-30s. She has built the most gorgeous house in her province in the Philippines with the wages she makes here, because it's an economy of scale. So what you're earning in Singapore dollars, actually goes a very long way in a village in the Philippines. So she kind of showed me like where she grew up, and it was a very modest little home. And then she showed me like the bricks and mortar house, this really nice, this house that she basically designed for her and her son to live in one day. It was stuff like that was really interesting. I think what was most heartbreaking and really very simple was that I would ask each of them, what do you want people to know about you? If there's one thing that you wanted people to know. And almost all of them said some variation of, we're human beings too, which was very telling.
Yeah.
Because I think there's been so many situations where they've been dismissed and dehumanized, either by individual employers, society, Singapore society, or also just by the bureaucracy that really doesn't favor them.
Yeah. And you definitely get a sense of that in your book that really comes through. And I think it's so important that, like you were saying, you spoke to them about what their lives were like back home and what their lives were like outside of their work. And I think that was probably some of the most unsettling and infuriating moments in the book were when their employers were kind of horrified at the fact, not horrified, but how dare you have your own agency and your own privacy, and you don't have a life outside of here. And it's the whole like, they have they have one day off a week, but they have a curfew. Dunedin had a curfew, a 7 p.m. curfew, and having their phone confiscated. And there was another moment with Mrs. Fan where she says to Donita, like, why have you closed the door? And she just kind of shows her underwear on the bed and then she scurries away. But it's just moments like that where it's like, no, you're not your own person. Like it's sort of like you belong to me. And that's the really unsettling thing. And I listened to podcasts that you've done and somebody saying it sounds quite like dystopian. And it does sound quite dystopian to an extent. I mean, obviously that's the reality of it, but it is dystopian in the sense of like this whole surveillance thing. And, there's a moment in the book where somebody I'm trying not to give any spoilers, but there's a camera put in somebody's room. Were there any of those more unsettling moments? Were any of those based on truth?
Yeah, I mean, I actually probably didn't include a lot of the really miserable or the details of misery that I have read, that I have heard about directly from domestic workers. Like, there have been maid abuse cases in the news, and those are they're so extreme. They're like physical violence towards these domestic workers, like women getting burned or women getting, beaten and things like that. They're so awful, and they do get those people, the people who perpetrate those things, they do get jailed. It does go to court, but it's like they're so extreme that, like, of course they have to. And then everyone else goes, oh, see, that's maid abuse. What I'm doing isn't. Like me yelling at, my domestic worker or making her work, 24 hours or whatever. That's not, but those things just like definitely are. So it's difficult. It's really like, it's almost like we hold up these extreme examples of maltreatment as what not to do. And then we really allow a very broad spectrum of other things. So for example, back to Mrs. Fan, it was actually unrealistic of me to write that someone like Mrs. Fan would never allow Donita to have her own room. Like an employer like that would never she would also never allow days off. Like I had to just kind of give in and let her give Donita it was one day off every 2 weeks. I had to, because Donita had to leave the house and had to have her romance with Sanjeev and had to investigate and stuff. But an employer like Mrs. Fan, very unlikely, would give any days off to her employee, and that would technically be allowed. And then also, like, just the space that she would give the domestic worker as well. I heard from a number of people, not just domestic workers, but friends of mine who have gone through the agencies and who know people who have domestic workers themselves, that some people have their domestic workers sleep under the dining table. So that's her room, which is, I mean, it was just hard to picture. It was, and like, even if there's a spare room available, it's like, no, that's not where she doesn't deserve that. She doesn't get that. So this real kind of lack of dignity, and this fact that all of this is sort of allowed, the fact that all of this is really not put under that umbrella of abuse at all. It's just kind of,
I did say before that I didn't have experience with domestic workers or anything, but I guess that I worked as an au pair for an Italian family. I went over to Italy when I was 19 and did that for about 3 months. And I think that they were a very rich family, but they treated me pretty well. But the grandma of the family once screamed at me in Italian because I'd forgotten to give the child his snack because he was napping at the time. So because I hadn't woken him up for his snack, she was screaming at me and calling me names in Italian, and I could understand little of it, but I knew I was in trouble. And it's like, that was frightening for me. So, and that was just the smallest. It's really the smallest scale in comparison to what these women have experienced. I found that difficult to deal with, and that was one encounter. Having that the level of abuse that they receive on a day-to-day, like, is just unimaginable. And I think the way that you explored sort of the class divide in Singapore and the kind of intersection of like wealth and privilege was just really well explored. And I have noted down a couple of quotes that I just wanted to read out to give our listeners a bit of a taste for the book. So you said, they behave like their feet have never touched the ground. And there was another section that says, these things don't seem separate for wealthy people: friendship, loyalty, transactions, debts. Can you just talk about those quotes and what the exploration of those themes of wealth and privilege meant to you?
Yeah, so for both of those, I think the first one is something that Cora says, I believe.
Yeah.
She's talking about Elizabeth's daughters, and she's wary of wealthy people and their children in Singapore, but then also in her experience of wealthy people in the Philippines. And that wealth gap in the Philippines is much larger. It's really, really noticeable, like the gap between poor and rich. And it's like you're on different planets, really. So the fact that when she talks about Ma'am Elizabeth's daughters, they're perfectly nice. They're not unkind to her, but they behave as if their feet have never touched the ground. They there's this ease to their lives. There's this sense that they don't really have to work very hard for what they what they have, and they probably don't realize that, because and Cora is someone who's been up to her elbows in work and just in the daily grind of making money or sending money home to her family or taking care of her nephew. So she starts off resenting these girls just ever so slightly, even though they're and then of course one of them turns out to be quite unkind to her. And so it's kind of like her suspicions are confirmed a little bit. But yeah, she keeps them at an arm's length because she knows that their feet have never touched the ground and that they're just never going to really be on the same plane, I guess.
Yeah, and there were so many awful employers throughout the book, and like the worst case scenarios of these elite people taking advantage of their domestic workers. But then you have a character like Mam Elizabeth, and I really liked her character, but I can totally see how, although she's very well meaning, she doesn't kind of have a clear sense of boundaries that Cora needs and ends up having to ask for. Why was it important to you to have this sort of antithesis character to all of the other awful employers?
I guess I definitely wanted to show that range. But to also show that like it's tricky, it's tricky even if you're a great employer, you can overstep those bounds and you can make someone very uncomfortable. And sometimes it is the domestic worker who says, no, we need boundaries. Like, I want to be treated with respect, but I don't want to sit at the table with you. I don't want to hear you, confide things to me. Like, there needs to be a line.
Yeah.
Mam Elizabeth just doesn't understand that, and actually makes things very uncomfortable for Cora. It was actually, I think, it was around the time when I was writing Mam Elizabeth's character and her sort of, and planning her arc a little bit, when I watched a play in Singapore, and now the name is escaping me, but it was by quite like a young sort of up and coming playwright who wrote about the dynamic between a middle-aged woman and her father, who employ a domestic worker to take care of the father because he's got some illness or something. And the woman is much stricter, and she's just a bit like Mrs. Fan. She sort of questions the domestic worker, puts cameras everywhere, and the father is more kind of easygoing. He's like, whatever, he sort of wants to build a relationship with the domestic worker. And there was a moment, I think it was something where like by doctor's orders, he wasn't supposed to eat something, like he wasn't supposed to eat meat or something. Right. And when his daughter was out of the house, he kind of, convinced the domestic worker to go out and buy him something like a minced pork dish. And she went out and bought it for him. And she comes back, and then, his daughter comes home. She looks in the trash. She sees that there's, that he's had some meat to eat. She flips out, but she doesn't necessarily get as angry at her father as she does at the domestic worker. Like, she gets annoyed with him, but she's really upset because she's like, what did I tell you? I told you. Like, even if he says that you should go and buy it, you shouldn't. And it was really, and there were other moments like that where he would be like, come on, I do this for me, come on. And she would have to do it. And then she would get into trouble for it. And afterwards, I was talking to the friend that I went to see the play with. And she was like, it was really hard to watch that woman treat the domestic worker so badly. And I said, yeah, I got that. But I found it really hard to watch that father, that man, treat the domestic worker like his accomplice and use his power in that way. It was benevolent. It was very friendly, but it really pissed me off. Like, it really made me angry that he was going, come on, you can do it. Like this, there's this power that you're exerting on this person. They have to do it, and then they get into trouble. They get into trouble either way. Yeah. Either with you or with your daughter. Like it was, I found that very unfair, and I found that really fascinating. And it's interesting, no one else felt that way. Everyone else I talked to about that play, they'd be like, oh God, she was so awful. And I'd be like, no, the dad was awful too. Yeah. The dad also, he did some something to make her very uncomfortable, and something to make her, to get her into trouble. Yeah. And yeah.
Puts her in a compromising position, doesn't it? And it was similar with Mr. Fan, who has his own issues, and he pretty much kind of stays out of most things to do with Donita, and Mrs. Fan is the main person that deals with Donita. But he does say to her, she asks his permission to leave the house, and he says like, yeah, go out, whatever. And then when she comes back, Mrs. Fan then says, right, you're never going out again. Yeah, even though she'd asked permission, but she still got in trouble. So she'd got that permission, which she shouldn't have to in the first place, but here we are.
And he's complicit because he doesn't step in, does he? Yeah. Like, his wife treats his maid terribly, and he doesn't say, okay, that's enough.
Which is just as bad, really.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I'm glad you see it that way.
No,
I feel very sorry for him.
it's infuriating. Now, one thing I also really wanted to talk about is the social media in the book and the Facebook groups, the mummy groups, and the sort of gossiping on these pages about the maids and, you know, affecting them from getting future jobs or saying, you know, my maid has dared to ask to go back to the Philippines because her father's died. She's only been here a week. How dare she? Any advice? And it's just these that we, like you were saying before, these really entitled women just using these platforms to just cry over something so insignificant. And, you know, there was that side of it, the negative side of social media, but then there's also later on as the narrative progresses, the sort of power of social media for like positive social change. And I was really curious what your own feelings are towards social media and how that sort of shaped the way you wrote Now You See Us.
Yeah, no, I feel that way about social media. Like, I feel like I don't buy it so much when, or I don't agree so much when people say, oh, you know, the world was better without social media. I mean, the people who say that tend to come from places where they had more freedom of speech and they had, you know, or they've had more of a voice. For us in Singapore, like, yeah, there's bad things about it, sure, but the ways in which certain views have been able to be platformed and certain people have been platformed has been really powerful. Like, I've been able to speak quite freely about issues regarding like race and misogyny and things like that, like, you know, 10, 15 years ago, or maybe more than that, you know, 20 years ago, you'd have to write a letter to the state-run media who would never publish it, you know? So there were people controlling that narrative who don't anymore. And also just the community building as well through social media, the way you can sort of find your people through social media. I think it's really wonderful. And so I appreciate it for that. I appreciate it particularly in places where the dominant narrative is controlled by the state, and in places where, you know, very conservative values are kind of override everything else. You do have alternative voices then, which is very exciting. And you do have conversations that are really valuable and community building.
Definitely.
Of course, on the other side of that, and there's also lots of misinformation. There's also everyone's an expert.
Yeah.
And you have to deal with that. And I do hope that we become more literate, so that we can, you know, we can kind of harness the good of social media. But I think for domestic workers, it's been a godsend. I think social media has been wonderful for them. Not so much politically, not so much in kind of, you know, spreading the message of like we're being mistreated, although that kind of thing has happened, but just like in terms of just having like a connection to the outside world. When you think about how like domestic workers like in Singapore or, you know, in this part of the world 25 years ago, like there would be nothing to occupy because they wouldn't be allowed to watch TV. It wouldn't be, you know, like there was just nothing to entertain them. Like they'd maybe read. They wouldn't be allowed to talk to their families. Like, you know, it'd be expensive to make a long distance call. So they'd write letters to home, like, and like the ones with children, you know, would only like get updates about their children every couple of months or weeks or whatever. And the fact that like, yeah, they can now like be on the phone with their families all day if they want to while they're cooking or they're doing things. The fact that like I know of a few who like raise their children from abroad, basically. Like they sit down every day, that when they're done with their work, they sit down every day in front of their iPad and they go, okay, like, and they Zoom with their kids and go, okay, what's your homework? You know, their kids back home in the Philippines, and they say, okay, I'm gonna talk you through these math problems or whatever it is. I mean, it's connected people so much more. It's made the world so much smaller, which is, I think it's been wonderful for domestic workers who otherwise are just so cut off and so isolated.
Definitely, yeah.
I think also the community building again amongst them, you know, the groups, the ways in which they can, there's a lot of solidarity building, I think, on their groups. Actually, it was interesting because the Facebook groups and the Facebook posts that you brought up, they're very much based on actual Facebook group posts.
Of course. I'd expect nothing less.
They were hardly fictionalized. In fact, I sometimes had to go into Facebook and go into those groups and just make sure that I wasn't using the person's exact name or their exact words, because they were almost word for word what I had seen on some of those groups. I joined a group. It was like a mom's kind of like Facebook group when my son was really young. And yeah, some of the things that people would post were just ridiculous. And then also what was interesting though is that I think social media empowers these women because they can be a bit more anonymous, and they can say what they want. They can also kind of like see what other people are thinking and kind of, you know, group them, you know, kind of gang up a little bit.
Yeah.
So there was this one Facebook post that I saw, and it was on one of the employment pages, like, you know, for employers looking for domestic workers. This woman, I thought it was satire. I was like, this is performance art. Like, this cannot be real. There's this woman who wrote, I'm looking for a domestic worker. These are my requirements. Like, that's perfectly normal. Like I want, these are the sorts of the character traits that I want and all that. But she took it to this new level where she said, these are the skills that I expect you to master in the first 90 days. And then she listed out day 1 to 5, memorize all bus routes, like children's spelling lists, buy the following things. Day 6 to 8, do this. I mean, she did this from day 1 to day 90, and she posted it. Like, these are things that if you think that you can do all these things, then you can join our family and you can work for us. And the responses were hilarious from domestic workers. One of them said, "Hi, I'd love to work for you. Let me get my PhD first." Which I love. And it just went on from there.
Gosh.
It just went on from all these domestic workers. Like, who do you think you are?
I'm so glad that people spoke against that. Like, that is horrendous.
That was horrendous. Yeah, that was pretty bad.
And is this woman, capable of doing these things herself? Like,
yeah, like, why don't we give her a 90-day schedule and that's going to follow it?
The absolute audacity. Yeah, just when I think you can't tell me something worse.
Yeah. And it was really nice to see like that so many people, and it was domestic workers, just saying this is, and then there were a few who were saying, look, those are her requirements. Why are you judging her for it? But it was like, no, they're
it
pretty
comes
bad.
To something when you've got to be like, no, this is too much now. You're expecting far too much.
There are other conversations that happen in Singapore. They start with like they'll start with like a news item. Like I think a couple of years ago, it shouldn't even be a controversy. It's so silly. A domestic worker who worked for a family, and they brought her to an exclusive country club for lunch. Like they were all having lunch, and they brought her along, and the country club refused to serve her. They said, we know she's your maid, so she has to wait outside. And they said, but we've signed her in as a guest, and she's our guest. And they said, no, she's not allowed here. And that there really shouldn't be any discussion about that. There really shouldn't be any sort of like, ooh, this is a debatable topic. But it was on social media. Like some people saying, oh yeah, those are the rules of the country club. They get to decide, and they need to have standards. And other people saying, that's wrong. And there've been a few incidents like that recently. I think there's a celebrity who said on record that she has a dress code for her maid, and she doesn't allow spaghetti straps or shorts in the house for her maid. And I mean, I went on social media to see what the reactions were, and they were largely in support of that. And anyone who said, well, it's about respecting your employee, and she can wear whatever she wants, it's fine. Anyone who said that was shot down and was told, oh, you don't know because she hasn't seduced your husband yet. Like there's these silly myths that came out of these conversations. So I would say like even that contributed to the research for this
novel. And I think you got a sense of that with Donita, because she is a younger character, and she dresses in a very different way to the other maids, and the maids do try and like advise her and say, like, be careful, because your employer will kind of target you for that, and will have this assumption that you're going to seduce their husbands. And it's just it's so awful. And I loved reading about her, because she was just kind of no, fuck you, I'm gonna wear what I want to wear. Like
yeah.
And she was really fearless, and that was really refreshing to read. And she was unapologetic in the way that she dressed, and she could have actually allowed Mrs. Fan to, like, Mrs. Fan was a really cruel, abusive woman, and she could have done some like serious damage to Donita's like self-esteem and her identity. But Donita somehow takes it all in a stride, and she's like I'm not going to let this bring me down. And I loved that about her. I would love to know, for my own curiosity, did you have a favorite character?
I would say it was between Donita and Cora. I liked writing Angel's parts as well. Angel's narrative helped me to sort of slow down the story a little bit and focus on grief and sadness and the sorts of things that women sort of have to keep inside while working in their employers' homes. But Donita was so much fun to write. Like her, and like the joy that she got out of her relationship with Sanjeev was just so much fun as well. Like there was a lot of I really wanted to focus on a character that in a lot of people's eyes would be considered as being really petulant and having like an attitude problem, but in her eyes and hopefully in the eyes of the reader, she's doing her thing. She's she's been matched. She's just been mismatched with like the worst employer.
She's amazing.
Yeah, I'm glad you think so.
No,
I mean, I will say the sort of the policing of bodies as well is something that I wanted to be quite explicit about with Donita, as well as with Angel, because it stems from like a really sort of, I don't know, a societal thing, a bias, this idea that these women shouldn't have agency or autonomy or any sort of sexuality, right? Because then they'll be distracted from their work.
Yeah.
And you're supposed to own them. So it comes from like people's individual attitudes, but then it also comes from like the official language around and like the frameworks around hiring a domestic worker here. Because you have to send them for a 6-monthly checkup, a health checkup. And if they're pregnant, they get sent home. Like they immediately they're kicked out of the country.
That's awful.
So they're not allowed to get pregnant. So there's a lot of fear around that. Like, oh, what if she, she fools around, she gets pregnant, and then I'm out of, a domestic worker, and then, I don't have someone taking care of my kids or whatever it is. And then there's just a lot that like the domestic worker is just sort of tied to your identity in so many ways. Like, her passport is connected to your passport. Her identity, like everything, like her insurance is connected to your name in some way. Like if she goes out, and I don't know, she gets stopped for something, it's like, she has to pull out her ID. She does have to say, I work for so-and-so. Like, I'm not here as an individual. I'm not here. I live in someone's home and I'm kind of under their care, except I'm not really.
Yeah, it's so upsetting, the fact that they're not allowed any agency and any, they're expected to not have this independence, and like their body isn't their own and their identity isn't their own. It's all wrapped up in the fact that they are a domestic worker and they belong to this family. And I think that's why it was so important and powerful in a sense that you had Donita and Sanjeev's relationship. You needed a character to have this sexual and romantic relationship, because it's as though these people, these elite people, don't perceive domestic workers in that way, and they don't think they should be allowed those kinds of things. But they're real human beings who deserve love and connection and community. And you think you have the right to restrict them from that, and it's wrong on so many levels. And whilst there are dark topics that you explore in the book, I think your balance, as we were talking about before with Jen Beagin with Big Swiss, you're also amazing at finding that balance with the light and the dark and finding the humor. Donita has some really awful moments with her employer, but then these moments with Sanjeev are just so funny. She's thinking about like licking his body up and down and he's just telling her about the sights of Singapore, and she's like, shut up, take me home.
Yeah, and she's restricted, right? She only has so much time, so she's like, I'm gonna do this. It's funny, I was interviewed sorry.
No, go on. No, go for it.
I was interviewed by a radio host here in Singapore who said, I want to talk about Sanjeev because he's quite hot. And then my mom listened to that interview and she was like, Sanjeev is quite hot. Oh, okay.
Yes, so Balli's mom.
Yeah.
I love it. He is, yeah, he definitely comes across that way. But I also think he was just kind of like in his own little world. Like he was just like, wanting to show her this, and he was, all very well meaning, like, oh, you've had all these people messaging you about your body, so I'm going to try and be different. And she's like, yeah.
I know. He's like, I'm respecting you. She's like, I want respect. Okay, we've had that. Now let's have sex.
I love it. Now, listeners, if it isn't already obvious, I am a big fan of Now You See Us, and I highly recommend that you pick up a copy. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes so you can buy yourselves a copy. It's out on the 25th of May. It's published by HarperCollins. And as I've seen the time, I'm realising I have to let Balli go, and I'm very sad about it because I've loved this conversation. And your book is, without using any fancy literary terminology, your book is amazing and I am obsessed.
Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for writing it, and thank you so much for joining me today. I've really loved talking to you, so thank you.